Yes, yes, sir.
Hi, thank you. This was wonderful, really, truly wonderful. I have a question about, somewhat derivative from the last council, about talking about welfare, socialism, subsidies, the attempts, the secular attempts to sort of level the playing field and to give back to people who are less fortunate, et cetera. But I'm wondering, as a society, as a civilization, have we poisoned the gift of charity by doing this, both on the recipient end, because you essentially replace the humility of charity with entitlement, and on the giving end, you replace the joy of charity with taxation. Now, from the strictly, purely economic standpoint, you could argue that minus transaction costs, there's no difference between charity and welfare. But I'd like to hear your comments on what we've done to ourselves by making that change.
What you said just at the end, I think, points to the dichotomous presupposition that people bring to these questions. That is, to think that economics can separate itself from the real world. Because the people acting, whether charitable giving or receiving, are human beings. They're not just individuals. We are, in a sense, individual, right? We're unique. We're genetically distinct from our parents. From the moment of our conception, we are that. But we are also always in relationship with one another. So a better word than the word we slip into, individual, is persons. And that richer reality of that reciprocal reality of that, is what the state fails at, and these economistic economists fail at, in seeing the rich connection. I mean, after all, it was really a biblical idea that invented the notion, and it built over time, of charity as an institution and institutional and international institution. It's the notion that we give not because you are of my faith, but because I am of my faith. And these institutions that grew, whether it's the hospital or the university or these charitable institutions that grew not by the state. The state later co-opts them. Fellow Texan here, Marvin Olasky, points this out in The Tragedy of American Compassion, where we make this mistake of thinking that compassion is giving things to people, when in reality what it is suffering with people. Sometimes we suffer because my bank account is lightened by what I do. But the more important thing than the material subsidy is the solidarity that occurs. And then you're probably going to bring, I hope you bring up Maimonides' ladder. Good, then I'll stop.
We're a great team, by the way.
You could call it the Judeo-Christian tradition.
What?
You could call it the Judeo-Christian
You
tradition.
could, yes. So Maimonides, 13th century Jewish sage, had different levels of charity, the highest being anonymity on both sides. But higher than that still is giving a person a job, teaching them a skill, which is, of course, a riff on or the joke is the riff on Maimonides, which is, give a person a fish they eat for a day, teach them how to fish they eat for a lifetime. The better version of that for this panel, which I wish I knew who said it. One of my readers said it, and I forgot who it was, which was basically something akin to embed them in a market and allow them to trade with others, and they'll become prosperous, right? You don't just, if you're reliant on finding a fish every day, you still have a pretty hard life. But if you can build a fishery and a trading business and sell fish to a large group of people, you have a chance to avoid economic insecurity. So I'm very sympathetic to the idea that we've destroyed some of these bonds. Of course, it goes way beyond charity. We've destroyed the family, right? I don't have to take care of my parents anymore because the state takes care of them through Social Security. I don't have to take care of my marriage is not an economic necessity anymore because we have welfare. So having said that, you could argue that all these government interventions are horrible. Of course, the flip side is maybe we had to do all those things because the family was falling apart and poor people can't find work. And so it's not obvious to me that even though I'm very sympathetic to the idea of the personal thing that we've lost, the personal thing doesn't always work so well. We have to be honest about that. It's not just a difference in transaction costs. It's going to be very difficult to get people to voluntarily give as much money as the government's able to tax and raise for welfare and helping the poor. So I think we have to be honest about that. At the same time, I'm optimistic that there are ways of improving other people's lives that don't just rely on money. And that's why I say, teaching a person a skill or hiring them is really the much more attractive thing than helping them by giving them things. But of course, there are people who are desperately poor and desperately need to receive something. So it's not, to me, it's a very complicated question. I like to think that in a world where we weren't taxed, we would give large sums of money. I think culture would emerge to encourage that. Would it be sufficient to dent or get rid of the pain of poverty to the level that the government's able to do? That's an open question. Open question.
I'd like to try to answer that question directly. First off, in Islam, one of the 5 pillars of the religion, one of the 5 basic rituals is something called zakat, which is obligatory charity. It's not voluntary, it's obligatory. As a Muslim, you must pay, if you have more than a certain minimum amount of wealth, you must pay 2.5% of the excess to the poor and needy. If you don't have that much, then you're entitled to collect up to that much towards the coming year's expenses. Now, the 3 differences between this and government, say, a basic income distribution, which people are talking about, are one, the spiritual aspect. It is important, even though it's obligatory, it's important that you do it voluntarily in order to get the moral credit for having done so. It is a personal issue, notwithstanding the difficulties of the personal distribution. The fact is that when you're giving personally to people you know if they really need it and if they're using it in a permissible manner or if they're using it for, they're wasting it on things that are forbidden by the religion. But there's also a third element that addresses the question about government's greater ability to access and distribute resources, and that is the element of corruption. Most Muslim countries in the world today, the government collects the zakat and distributes it. You want to know how much goes to the poor and needy? Forget about it. Here in the United States, where we have strict separation of church and state, the zakat is distributed through mosques and organizations. I'm involved with one of them, the Islamic American Zakat Foundation, and a great deal of effort is gone in to make sure that the process is transparent. Anybody can look at our books. The people who come to us are not only given money, but taught how to fish, as it were. And so we try to make things very effective, as do the other organizations.
Yeah, so I think there's an important third type of corruption, and that's the corruption of the taxer, who is in some sense trying to do the work of the Holy Spirit or trying to take over for the work of the Holy Spirit and say, I know how you should live, or I know how much of your income should be transferred from this person to this person, and I'm wary of the notion that we know how to do that. Now, granted, there are going to be better ways to do things and worse ways to do things, and there are a lot of really, really exciting proposals on the horizon. I think there's a lot of interesting stuff to be said about universal basic income or federal job guarantees, or again, better and worse ways of doing these sorts of effecting these sorts of changes. But I think fundamentally there was a lot of discussion in the first panel about sort of the need to recover like a full and flourishing and vibrant idea or notion of the human person. And I just don't think that happens with redistributive institutions. We mentioned earlier, we said a couple of things about what our tradition might have to say to 18-year-old students, and they will sometimes they'll say, give a man a fish and he'll eat for a day, teach him how to fish and he'll eat forever. Well, how do we know that the problem is that the person doesn't have any fish? Or how do we know the problem is they don't know how to fish? And moreover, how do we know that you, 19-year-old sophomore at Samford University in Birmingham, Alabama, are well equipped to go to pick any country in the world and teach them how to fish? Again, I think I don't want that to sound like desperate or fatalistic, but to say that what I'd like to sort of get back to some of the things that were discussed in the first panel on really recovering, it's like fully vibrant human relationships within our capacity to do so.
I just want to add one thing to that because it's too good not to mention, which is there's a lot of interest right now in what's called effective altruism. You may have heard of it. It's a really important idea, and I think I hope many of us here are involved in charities and religious groups that are trying to make people's lives better, and we know how hard that is. It's extremely difficult, and a lot of those organizations are handicapped by the fact, for me, that a lot of people just want to give money and don't care about whether it works or not. They just want to, say they donated. I think that's a huge problem with charity in general. And so when people say, well, let's make sure it's effective. Well, unfortunately, it's extremely difficult to find out if it's effective. For a long time, there was a huge effort to get rid of malaria, which is a great idea. Malaria is a horrible, horrible killer in the poorest parts of the world. So one of the things they did is they gave people bed nets to protect them from mosquitoes, and they used them to fish, which is perfect. What they really needed was to learn how to fish. They didn't need a malarial bed net. They knew much better than the people who came. And so it's the reverse of what you were saying.